Well, welcome everybody to Question of the Week. This is a Facebook Live session in which I answer your science faith questions. Every Monday morning, 9:30 a.m. Pacific Standard Time, 12:30 in the afternoon if you are on the East Coast. Happy President's Day to everybody. The RTB offices are closed today, so I'm going to be doing this Facebook Live broadcast from my home office. So the settings that you're seeing are a little bit different today than what you would normally see, because again, I'm doing this broadcast from home instead of the RTB offices in Covina, California. Anyway, the purpose of this Facebook Live session is to answer questions that people have posed to me throughout the previous week on my Facebook page. Whenever I post articles or links to radio interviews or TV interviews, podcasts, videos, invariably there are follow-up questions and comments, many of which are very insightful, that people ask. People send me private messages with questions, and try as I might, I just simply cannot get to all the questions that people ask. And so this is my attempt to try to at least engage some of the questions that I'm asked. And what I'm doing is choosing questions, again, posed to me the previous week that I think to be intriguing and questions that I think to have broad interest for those of you who are interested in science faith issues. And even for people who may not necessarily be interested in science faith issues, at least questions with broad appeal and broad interest. Okay, if you are watching this and you want to say hi, you want to check in, hit the like button, put a comment in the comment section of this Facebook Live broadcast. I love to see who's watching and just to have you say hello, that means a lot to me. Also, if you are hearing something that I'm saying and you don't agree with me, please feel free to post a dissenting perspective in the comment section as well. If you want to ask a question for next week's broadcast, I think you know what to do. Okay, without any further ado, let's go ahead and take this week's question, which comes from my friend Robert Medvey. And I've met Robert last summer. He was a participant in the lab, and I'll explain what the lab is in just a moment for those of you who aren't familiar with the lab. But he was a participant in the lab, a young man, a senior in high school, who has aspirations to be an astrophysicist, and I very much think that he is going to one day achieve those dreams, those aspirations. A fine young man, an honor to know him and to call him my friend. But Robert is a graduate of a program that we have at Reasons to Believe called the Lab. This is actually a unique 3-day mentoring program designed for high school and college students between 16 and 22 years of age who have interest in going into careers in the sciences, engineering, or in medicine. And many of these students are Christians who want to make sure that they are able to successfully navigate a science education and learn how to thrive as scientists or as medical practitioners or as engineers with respect to their careers. And so it's, again, an intensive 3-day mentoring program, morning, day, and night, where the students get to hang out with RTB staff scholars as well as people who volunteer with the ministry who are scientists or medical doctors or engineers who are successful in their careers but also are deeply committed to their Christian faith. And it's a chance for these students to learn from experts how to flourish in a scientific environment, but also how they can capture a vision for how they can serve the Lord as scientists, as engineers, and as doctors. Help them to appreciate the fact that they are actually embedded missionaries within the scientific and medical communities. It's an exciting program, and this is where I met Robert Medvey. And again, I think he benefited enormously from the lab. But we're excited that we're offering the lab 2 times this year. One time, this will be this summer in June in in Georgia, about an hour and a half south of Georgia in Pine Mountain, Georgia, on the Impact 360 campus. So if you go to our website and you look for the lab, you can find information about how you can register for that program. And then also in January of 2018, we're going to do a lab session here in Southern California. If you, again, are interested in the lab, you need to apply. So for those of you who are 16 to 22 years of age and you're interested in a career in science or medicine, as Christians, you may want to consider checking out the lab. If you are parents and you have children who have interest in science, you may want to send them to the lab. In fact, we invite the parents to come along with the students to the lab so that it's a family experience that the child and parent are going through together. And then also, if you just know somebody, maybe you're a pastor, a youth worker, and you just know of a young person who has an aptitude for the sciences or for medicine, you may want to alert them to the lab program. And I'll put a link in the notes underneath the on my Facebook page with links to, again, the lab. So if you want to follow up on that, you most certainly can. Okay, without any further ado, let's get to Robert Medvey's question. And Robert, to preface the question, sent me an interesting video link of about a 2-minute link, and I'll post that as well on my Facebook page, of a feature describing a really unusual garden associated with the Alnwick Castle in Northumberland, the UK. And this garden is called the Poison Garden, and it was the vision of the Duchess of Northumberland, who wanted to recreate a garden on the castle grounds that would have unusual features that would make it a point of interest. And so they decided to put in the garden poisonous plants. And they have 95, 100 different plants that are in the garden, either where the plants themselves are poisonous or parts of the plants are poisonous. And in fact, it's fun to see how the gardeners go into the garden and care for the garden. They have to suit up in these protective garments so that none of their skin is exposed to the plants. The interesting thing is that some of the plants that are in the garden are actually plants that are found in probably most people's yards, believe it or not. So this prompted Robert to ask the question, why would God create poisonous plants? What would be the purpose of these plants? And so that's what I'm going to take on here in the next few minutes. A really provocative question in many respects, because this is the type of question that skeptics and believers alike ask. Why would God create the world in the way that he did? How do we explain some of the features of the world that at times seem to be contrary to the idea that God is all-powerful, all-knowing, all-loving, and all-good? If that's the case, why would the world look the way that it looks? Why would there be poisonous plants that can cause harm if this is indeed a world that's the product of a creator's handiwork? So this question that Robert asks is really a facet of a larger question that many people ask about the nature of the world around us in light of God's goodness. And my response really is twofold. The first is that there is actually a rationale for why God would create poisonous plants. And the second part of my answer is that these plants, I believe, represent, in effect, God's providential care for humanity. Ironically, but yes, I think it's part of God's care for humanity to create plants that can be harmful to us. So what would be the purpose of these poisonous plants? Well, to appreciate that, what we need to do is consider essentially some basics of ecology. I'm not an ecologist, I'm a biochemist, but I think most people have a basic understanding that in ecosystems there are 4 types of organisms. There are the primary producers, those would be the plants in most ecosystems. There are the primary consumers, herbivores that would consume the plants. There are secondary consumers, carnivores that eat the herbivores. And then finally there are detrivores, organisms that will feed on dead, decaying organisms as a way to cycle nutrients within the ecosystem and to create things like soil that allow for the primary producers to grow. The primary producers, of course, can take materials from the environment and energy from sunlight or chemical energy in some instances and convert it into organic foodstuff. And they form the basis of any kind of ecosystem. Now, of course, if herbivores come along and they overconsume the primary producers, the ecosystem will undergo collapse. This is why carnivores or secondary consumers are so critical in ecosystems, because they control the herbivore numbers, allowing for the primary producers to flourish. Because again, if the primary producers are overconsumed by the primary consumers, then the ecosystem will undergo a meltdown. And this is why there are growing data sets that indicate when the top predators in ecosystems disappear, the ecosystems undergo a collapse. So these large carnivores are playing a critical role. This is also why there are pathogens, organisms that will destroy and kill off basically not only primary consumers but secondary consumers. This is why there are disease-causing organisms, why there are pathogens in these systems, because they help to control both primary and secondary consumer levels, which again maintain stability in the ecosystem. But you can now begin to see why plants would be poisonous, because the toxins associated with plants would be another mechanism by which the primary consumers would be put in check. Another way to ensure that these plants are not overconsumed in the ecosystem. And the fact that plants produce toxins isn't really that surprising, because they also produce compounds that are attractants, that will attract certain types of primary consumers. This is why plants produce fruit. And this is why the fruit is so sweet and tastes so flavorful, and why it is so brightly colored. It attracts primary consumers that are going to consume the fruit, and in doing so will spread seeds throughout the ecosystem, allowing, again, those plants to increase in number within the ecosystem. But by the same token, plants also produce chemicals that might repel herbivores. Maybe they just make the plant taste really poorly, or maybe they're irritants, or maybe they are toxins. In fact, it's interesting because many of plants that actually can be harmful to humans have a bitter taste to them. And we associate bitter flavors sometimes with foods that we don't want to eat, we don't like to eat. And that bitter flavor is a way for us to be protected from the harmful effects of those plants. And that's also why we like to eat fruit, because by eating fruit, we're helping to spread the seeds. So these attractants and these toxins, again, are part of the way in which these plants interact with primary consumers in such a way that their livelihood is preserved, but their capacity to reproduce is actually enhanced. So you can see this as actually an elegantly designed system. Now, interestingly enough, even compounds like caffeine, which actually has a bitter taste, are actually toxins. Caffeine is produced by a number of plants as a way to ward off insects, because the insects will consume the caffeine and it will stimulate their nervous system to the point they actually die. As human beings, fortunately, we can consume small amounts of caffeine and it will stimulate our nerve system without causing us harm, or at least undue harm. So again, we benefit indirectly from the fact that plants produce toxins, interestingly enough. Now, this leads us actually to the second reason why I believe God created a world with poisonous and toxic plants. Because the very properties that make compounds produced by the plants irritants, or compounds that would be toxins impacting a cardiovascular system, impacting our neurological system, are the exact kind of properties you would want to have for materials that are drugs. Many painkillers are actually irritants that through counter-irritation help to mask the effect of pain. And of course, drugs that impact the cardiovascular system, if taken in large amounts, of course, can be extremely harmful, but in small amounts can modulate the activity of the cardiovascular system in such a way to compensate for things like high blood pressure and so on and so forth. And so I would actually argue that these poisonous plants reflect part of God's providence for us. In fact, it's interesting, there's a whole area of medicine and pharmacology known as ethnomedicine and ethnopharmacology, where scientists actually go out and they study the traditional folk medicines of people that are hunter-gatherers or people that live in rural environments in underdeveloped countries. Many of these people practice folk medicine, and there's some actually a scientific basis to what they're doing because they're taking extracts from plants. I just did an interview last week on a program called When's World, where we talked about the secretion from toads that contains toxins that can be used to drive drug discovery. And so I would argue that as part of God's providence, he has built into the creation everything that we need as human beings to flourish and to survive. And it's through science that we can unleash or unlock God's providence. And I think these poisonous plants and things like the skin secretions of toads that are toxic can actually serve our benefit when we understand, again, the science behind these compounds that contribute to the toxic properties. You know, it's really interesting because in Genesis 1, we're taught that we are to multiply and to fill the earth. We are to subdue the earth and bring it under our control. Genesis 2 tells us that we have dominion over the creation. But if we go to the Genesis 28 through 31, or continue into Genesis 31, we also see essentially what I think to be the framework for how ecosystems function, namely where God is teaching human beings that in order for all life on the planet to be able to survive, you have to have plants that are present. You have to have plants that will basically form the basis of the food chain. And so many people see Genesis 1, 28 through 31 as kind of a promotion of a vegetarian lifestyle. I actually see it as an ecology lesson, teaching Adam and Eve that as they multiply and fill the earth, as they bring the earth under their control, that they have a responsibility to be stewards of the planet, that they cannot exploit the planet to their benefit without paying attention to the way ecosystems function. And so when the text says that the ground is cursed because of us as human beings as a result of the fall, I believe it's because our relationship with the creation has been damaged and distorted as a result of the fall. And of course, we cause enormous amount of ecological damage. And so I think as a Christian, we're called to be stewards of the planet. We're called to be environmental activists. But it's an intelligent environmentalism where we are to make sure that we're not engaged in environmental practices that will bring harm to human beings, but will benefit human beings and benefit all life on earth. That means we need to be effective stewards of the planet. But I also believe that as part of that, God has endowed within the creation those things that we would need so that as we subdued the earth and brought it under our control, brought it under our dominion, that we would be able to take advantage of what God has built into the creation so that we could truly multiply and fill the earth and in do so bring glory to God. So anyway, Robert, great question that connects to a larger issue that many Christians and non-believers have about the nature of creation. And I think the lesson here is that as we probe these kind of questions, many times we see what seems to be a bad design or a questionable design with respect to the way that nature is put together actually turns out to have a rationale and a purpose. And it makes sense that even though God is all-powerful, all-knowing, and all-good, that he indeed would create a world where there might be things that are harmful, but in doing so, there's actually a greater good, a rationale or a purpose that God has in doing so. So anyway, Robert, thank you for that great question. I would invite you to offer on the comment section some insight into your experience with the lab. And again, I would really encourage all of you who are listening, if you know of a young person who might be interested in science or medicine as a career, or if you are a young person and those are your career aspirations, please check out the lab and consider taking part in that wonderful program. We've gotten an incredible feedback from people who have participated in the lab. So anyway, with that, I'm going to go ahead and bring this broadcast to a close. Thank you so much for all of you who are listening live, those of you who will listen to a recording of this broadcast. Thank you for all of you who are posting comments, and thank you to all of you who just checked in and said hello and who like this broadcast. We really at Reasons to Believe appreciate very much your encouragement, your support, your engagement with the ministry that we do. And so final words as we bring everything to a close on this Monday morning, and that is that the more that we know about science, the more that we have reasons to believe. God bless all of you.